Hi, I'm Andy Slater. Welcome to my session on Azure, and the title is How Not to Screw Up Your Move to Azure. So not in capital letters on purpose there. I'm going to try and give you some tips and tricks based on our experience of moving lots of customers on-prem or out of data centers into Azure, and hopefully trying to make sure that the issues that we've seen and the opportunities there are in Azure you can take advantage on. So I look after the Azure practice within Node 4. We've got a really great team of engineers that work through this digital transformation with customers. And let's get into some of the detail. Now, because we've gone through many migrations with customers, and we've also helped customers dig them out of some sticky problems, I wanted to start with a few interesting pitfalls that we've seen customers make. And I've anonymized the actual pictures of the people in the slides, but here we go in terms of I want to try and demonstrate things where we see major problems in customers, start on a bit of a fun but cautionary note. So here are my stories from the front line. So this one, obviously this isn't the real guy, it's a stock photo that I've found to illustrate probably the way that they were feeling when they made this mistake. So what we had is a customer that accidentally ran a deployment script. I think it was a Terraform script, and they'd previously, but last time they used it against production. They made some changes, something had happened, and then basically they'd run it against test. So they'd run it against the production environment versus what they thought was test. And this is a common problem we see whereby things are automated, parameterized in terms of scripts, and you've got to be really careful that it's easy to make lots of change quickly in an environment, and it needs to have the right control against it, so don't make that mistake. We also, now this is quite a funny picture. This is a real thing again. We had a developer that was looking to use the API management tools within Azure. There's a little performance box to start taking advantage of all the amazing stuff in Azure. And we saw it pop up, and they'd spent $1,000 in a day, which was a bit of a anomaly. Now, lucky for this chap, we kind of caught it and gave him a call and said, "Look, were you expecting to spend $14,000 by the end of the month?" And I think he was very happy that we caught that mistake out. But it's really easy because from an Azure perspective, it's not always simple to understand the cost ramifications. And what you'll find as well is, even if you launch a service, we had it with a customer the other day around some of the SQL PaaS services, the pricing when you launch it maybe doesn't include the licensing, it just includes the compute cost. So we get people that do get caught out quite a lot in terms of actually really not tracking their costs, and that's another cautionary tale. The next one is more of a frustration, this instance, but we have, and part of the governance discussion that we will touch on later is using tagging. And tagging's, think of it like a sticky note against an environment. So customers sit down, we all agree what the right tags are going to be, and then Team A are going off, and in this instance they were making sure that every time they launched a resource, they put a little tag against it that said environment capitalized equals production. And without any control, another team had started, this developer had misspelt the word environment, it was all lowercase. So then when we were doing reporting at the end of the month, we had different tags for the same things, and there was no consistency. But that's the face you probably felt after you'd sat down and agreed something in a meeting, but then it loses interpretation as well. This is another example whereby we'd had a company that weren't really using Azure officially, probably a little bit of shadow IT, and the developer was starting to do stuff in his own account and set up a company account, but with his own details on, and making sure you get the kind of root privileges and the details right at the start is important. And in this example, the developer had got him up and running, done some projects, thought nothing of it really, very innocently. But then as the company and he leaves, or the company starts adopting more production systems and forget about how the account was set up, who's got owner privileges, this guy had left, it was his personal email address. So but we've had it before where people have left, and whether it's AWS or Azure, and we've had to go and get legal legal notification to the providers to then crack open to get access to the account because it's not been set up correctly, or it's been a personal account that the company's ended up adopting. So another good example. I'm trying to build up the fear factor. So and then I'll give you all the answers and the solutions and the tips as we go. And this last is a probably different example, and we do see different motivations within organisations. Sometimes, with Azure, I think everyone needs to be cognizant that there is a big personal benefit from people's CVs of delivering Azure projects. It's a hot sizzle kind of area, and there's a lot of ability. And we always get slightly depressed when we see a customer that are really committed to going to Azure, and then the actual delivery of the kind of modernization of it is limited, if not really not delivered anything really. We see customers pick up from what place A, move it to Azure, and don't use any of the capabilities in the platform. So for me, that is a massive failing as well, and especially when everyone kind of celebrates that, we've moved this VM to Azure, but actually it's probably, as you can see in the next slide, probably costing more money than it is and not delivering anything. And then obviously when you don't think about things or use the platform, Azure's quite an expensive place to be if you don't do it right. If you're just doing VM moves and trying to match SLAs, and you understand that if you pick a VM up and you've got a single point of failure, then even to get an SLA out of Azure, you need to pick a specific instance type that can support premium disk, and that all pricing adds up. So this horrible time when you get your end of month bill and you've moved it, everyone celebrated, and now you're feeling the pinch point of actually you've moved something that is not modernized, it's not taking advantage of the platform, and then it's really expensive. So what do? You then have to commit to 3-year reserved instances to drive the price down, and then that's kind of balancing the books to get back from what you've spent, and then there's no money left for you to start investing in in projects to then modernize applications. So it's kind of, the project's not delivered, and then there's a lot of probably negativity after that positive start. So they're the horror stories, or not the horror stories, but they're some of the pitfalls we see customers, or we have seen customers get into, anonymized of course. So what I want to do now is to give you 7 tips really, or 7 things that we want customers to think about and do to help you make sure that transition to Azure is successful, and give you some things to think about. The first point that I want to talk about is, before you start or really get into the juicy detail of Azure, there's a brilliant place to start, and that's the Cloud Adoption Framework. So the Cloud Adoption Framework is really a lifecycle management tool. All the people within Microsoft they live and breathe Azure on a daily basis. They've designed the services, how they work, and they've also seeing lots of projects and looking after customers. And the Cloud Adoption Framework really is the documentation of basically best practices of Azure. How do you migrate workloads? How do you operate Azure? How do you handle governance? How do you get the business bought into using Azure? Microsoft have done all the hard work, so a really good place to start is to read about what that good looks like from their perspective, and then you can make your own decisions. So how do you find out about the Cloud Adoption Framework? Well, in the portal, it's pretty easy to find. So if you go into the main kind of homepage of the portal and scroll down to the bottom, what you'll find if you look there is you're looking for the Quick Start Center within the Azure portal. So if you click on the Quick Start Center, there's a little section called Azure Setup Guide. And if you click in there, then it gives you a kind of Azure before you start type set of information, and that then links into the Cloud Adoption Framework. So before you do anything, once you've kind of set up the portal, I'd go into that, and also all of the tech documentation online will cover that as well. Now, the Cloud Adoption Framework really breaks your journey to Azure down into several stages. So it starts off with strategy, whereby the company's thinking about moving to Azure. Is it a great idea? Which project should we start with? So you've got a whole section there. And then it moves into planning. So how do we upskill the company? Because frankly, there's probably going to be not many people in your organisation that know Azure. You've not got that scale. So there's whole access to learning materials, starting to think about governance and planning for a move. And readiness is all around putting the foundations in to then build a tenancy within Azure, do the right things, and give yourself a landing zone. So you've got a known good entity to then point the kind of migration workloads. And then the next stage is adoption, and Microsoft break this down into either migration, so you're more or less doing like for like, or refactoring or mild re-engineering of workloads into Azure, or innovation where it's a bit more aggressive, where you're developing more cloud natively and looking at how you take advantage of the services. And this is all documented, so that's a great place to start. And that's my first tip. Get all over the cloud adoption framework, understand it, and really get to grips with the documentation and the templates that you can find in there. Point number 2, and I think this is starting at that strategy side of it, and it's so important that you buy the business in to a move to Azure. So my first tip really is to get a mandate within your organisation to move to Azure. You know your own company, you know what that means in terms of how do we get everyone bought in, who do I need to buy in to the move to Azure. And the big guidance I can say is to find an adoption project. So this kind of first slide really talks through about starting with an assessment. Now, Microsoft might encourage you to do this for a partner, or you certainly do it yourself. And there's a number of tools. And what we're trying to do with an assessment is to look at your estate where you think looks like something you want to get a cost or a gut feel, kind of finger in the air. What's this going to look like, commercially on Azure? Is there a business case there to move it? And there's a number of Azure Migrate is a great tool that you can stand up within your tenancy. You can point it at a range of kind of VMs or physical servers, database workloads as well. You can bring in through a data migration assistant. There's tools out there like Cloudamize, Turbonomic, MoveAir. So what all these tools try and do is take a profile of your existing workloads, and they try and represent what that looks like within Azure. So at a basic level, if we're looking at VMs or servers, it'll say, right, okay, here's workload A. That's going to look like these types of instances within Azure. You've got the ability to either move it like for like and have an instance size that's got maybe 4 CPU, 16 gig of RAM, or actually it's only using 2 CPU, 8 gig of RAM, so you could downsize. And you start with this profiling, and what these tools typically do is spit out a cost for what? Almost a lift and shift. And this is kind of where you've got to be a bit careful, because a lot of these out-of-the-box tools don't understand the application in terms of what that could look like in terms of a move to using PaaS services. So that's where you need to do a lot of work around representing that. But you can do this in a couple of weeks, run the tool, make sure you've got a good benchmark in terms of when is a good time to see maybe either a really busy period at end of month or maybe a quiet period, so you get to see the proper right sized values. They're not great at telling you about network traffic, so that's something you're going to have to think about. They will not understand where you've got intraday VNet charges or what, how you're going to map out your actual Azure deployment, but they will give you a really good starting position. So first thing to do is to get that bucket of costs. So do a wide ranging assessment, get a feel. Does it look like there's something there to then discuss with the business, and you can get some really good TCO analysis. But what I would encourage everyone to do is focus first on an adoption project. So when you're looking through that data and you're looking at the different projects, then focus on that. So that's kind of the next point really. And what I mean by an adoption project is, rather than starting with this big bang, pick it up, move it, lift and shift, try and find a quick win. So a quick win is typically something like a web application that's that can easily be refactored, so you can take it from a number of VMs to moving the database into something like the Azure SQL PAS service, and you can use the data migration assessment tool for that. So that'll tell you all the bits you need to change to get it into the Azure SQL PAS service. And then from a web perspective, you've got a couple of options to modernize, really. You can go straight into the web apps if you think your application can support it. And if not, try falling back down onto scale sets. So scale sets is where basically you can take where you've got maybe a single or a couple of VMs currently behind a load balancer and move it into an Azure scale set, which will give you some dynamically scaling infrastructure, whereby with Azure, especially in UK South, you've got multiple availability zones. So you can move from maybe picking up an application web VM on-prem to moving it into a scale set and dynamically having scale across multiple data centers, and then having it automatically contract and expand. And that's a really easy, quick win to do. And you just need to work on maybe getting rid of some of the dependencies that means it can't scale properly. Other good examples of adoption projects are disaster recovery. So you can point Azure recovery service, or maybe a tool like Veeam or Zerto at an Azure tenancy. Virtual desktops, especially with the current pandemic situation at the moment. That's a real common requirement we've had over the last few days of how do we scale up our Windows virtual desktop architecture, and scale that up. So that's a really good project. And what I would do with the adoption project is go and use the Azure calculator. This is where you need to put your own intelligence in there. You need to look at some of the data you've got from the tooling, but then look at how you can then start building calculators to with your own knowledge to basically give yourself a really good defined cost range of so you can take back to the business and say, with some certainty, I've got this kind of cost range, and you could add the costs in that you wouldn't normally get through the tools around the different additional services you need to think about. And then as you go and maybe doing a small POC build, come back and refine that calculator. You open a calculator in the portal, that's there, you can share it with people, you can go back in, you can do iterations, you can copy it, you can tweak it, and you can use that calculator to basically refine it. So that tip is to do a big assessment, get a good TCO analysis to say that there's a mandate, and then focus in on a small, quick win adoption project where you can move quickly, get some good news under your belt, and then go to the next project, and then build this conveyor belt of migration and modernisation. The next tip's coming into thinking about the architecture and the regions you're going to use within Azure, and it's worth giving it some thought. Now, Microsoft have got a recommendation around using your hub and spoke model from an architecture perspective in terms of Azure deployment. What that means in reality is, if you think about when you're building in Azure, you might have, and this is really when you've got more than one project. So we're looking at multiple 2, 3, 4, 5 projects, so where you've got different teams that are all building or delivering projects within Azure. The idea of the hub-spoke architecture is you don't want to duplicate costs of share of services, so things like firewalls or centralized networking like express route gateways, things that multiple projects are using. You don't want to say project A having shared firewall infrastructure in there, and then project B and C, and duplicating that cost. But also you want to have standardization, so you want different projects to adopt the same standards. So a hub spoke network is where you have a hub network where you have shared services effectively. Typically this is things like internet gateways, security, management networks, that kind of infrastructure. So you have effectively a hub network with this shared service infrastructure in, and then you have projects with different subscriptions and VNets that then share that hub network. So what you get is stronger security because you've got standardization, and lower cost because you're not duplicating it across multiple projects. Now, what I would say is when you're thinking about regions is have a look, because not every region offers the same services, and this is something that does catch customers out. So I would point you to this website, azurcharts.com. It's a great website. It's built by one of Microsoft's employees. And one of the areas that I'd look at, if you go into regions and the Azure region scope section, you can do comparisons. So in the UK, the normal thought process of customers is, right, we're going to use UK South and UK West, and we're going to mandate that on all projects and do that at the start. Now, what you'll find is, if you do this comparison here, there are some services that you can get in UK South, but you can't get in UK West. So things like cognitive search, container instances, those things aren't available in UK West. So if you pick that up as your DR or your secondary environment, you might get caught out when you've got a project and it's deployed beautifully in UK South, but the paired region isn't up to scratch. So therefore you need to think about, well, we're at the European regions, etc. So use that website. There's loads of other good stuff about SLAs, releases. So think about your regions as well as the design and the topology for how you're going to use Azure. A biggie next one. So my fourth point is to think about governance before you build anything. Now, one of the things that you want to do in that after the strategy stage, in your planning phase, so you've got an idea for an adoption project, you've got some high level designs about topologies and the regions, you then need to stop. You need to think about how the organization is going to control and is going to be comfortable with what you deploy in Azure, because what you don't want to create is a situation where you've got some really great controls around your existing environment, but you end up with this kind of Wild West where developers are just have got no guidelines because there's no parity in terms of this, there's no coverage of what the things you can do and the policies in Azure. So first things you need to do is make someone responsible for that Azure cloud governance, and whether that's a team or an individual, that's really important, because you need someone that can steer the team, someone that third parties can come to and say, this team wants a VPN to X, and you said that you didn't want that, but the other teams do it a different way. You need to have some filter and some pivot point that can help support that. Also, what I would do is to have a look at your current controls. A lot of people have got information security management systems, maybe ISO 27001 online. There's loads of good stuff in there that you've got at the moment. Have a look, work through, see what's portable, and see where you've got the problem points between Azure. There will be things within your ISMS that mandate things like encryption or antivirus or patching. What you need to do is think about the translation of that, because maybe, I don't know, an antivirus within or a SIEM service within your current environment is nice and easy, but there's different tools, different approaches. There's gaps that will open up because not all tools do the same thing within Azure, and you're dealing with PaaS services as well, which gives you different problems. So there's that translation perspective. But what I'd recommend you do is you work on giving the teams at least a baseline, a basic outlining of some fundamental things that can give guidance before you start. Microsoft, within the Cloud Adoption Framework, call this a governance MVP, a minimum viable product. I'm not sure it's a product, but a minimum viable policy, let's say. And there's templates there. So you can find on the link that I've put there. So there's a few things to focus on. Identity management. So who's going to be able to get access to what rights do people have, how do you, what's that role mapping? So identity is a big area. Going back to that ISMS, security baseline, what login do you need, what regions, data handling, that kind of stuff. They need to think about resource consistency. So when Team A and Team B do the same thing, how do you make sure they're doing, working to a consistent? What are your guidelines? What does the tool chain look like in terms of the release processes? And the last bit, don't forget cost management, because you will get burnt unless you've got some controls and giving the teams guidance around what's acceptable, but how are you tracking spend and how are you setting the budgets with the teams? Now, like I said before, if you go to that link there are some templates for each of these areas that give you a good starting position. They're almost, you can roll them out like the policies suggest, but you need to tweak them and personalize them. So pick up those documents, have a look at that link, and that'll give you a good starting position. The fifth bit the fifth point is management groups and subscriptions. Now, management groups probably came out about 12 months ago. So customers who've already got Azure might not be using management groups. And subscriptions is something, I think the quote is that 90% of Azure customers only use one subscription. And the guidance is slightly different to that. What you want to do, so a management group is a bucket of permissions for a team or a group of people. It is what it says on the tin. So you want to think about the structure and the hierarchy of that. So you might have an IT operations team, and that might be defined within your AD, and we're going to talk about roles in a little bit. But effectively, what you want to do is to make sure that they can see the subscriptions and the resources that they can manage, and you've maybe got a route management group with more than one person. You don't just want one owner of, you want at least two owners at that top level from a route perspective. And then you can segment management groups by what makes sense to you. It could be by geography, it could be by application, it could be by department. You need to work on the hierarchy of command of and who wants to see multiple projects. So you'll have one team that deals with infrastructure that might want to see all projects, and then you might have just project team A that just needs to see their projects. And this is where subscriptions become important. If you've got more than one application, and even if you've got one application, we would encourage you to use multiple subscriptions. Subscriptions are a really good isolation point, not only for controlling where management groups and role-based access control comes in, but for cost management, and you've linked to subscriptions is limits on services and usages within Azure. So the idea is that from a subscription perspective, certainly try and break a subscription out per application, and then try and break it out in maybe a production versus non-production. We've got some customers that have got 4 top-level subscriptions, one for maybe staging, dev, production, test, or you can do, what we typically do with customers is we do a subscription for production application, and then maybe 1 or 2 subscriptions for the non-production, subscriptions. And then you've got more segmentation between your tenancy. You've not got everything loading into one subscription, where maybe you'll find when you start looking at costs and security controls, it makes your life a damn sight easier to have that separation at a subscription level. And that brings us on to the 6th point, which is configuring RBAC, or role-based access control. Now, if we've got the management groups and the subscriptions through, RBAC is probably one of the biggest areas that you need to get right. So this is all about how do you then get more granular. We've got a management group, but also think about the roles that are attached to the management group, but also the people within there. You might have a team of DBAs that only need access to the database assets within the different subscriptions. You might have a security officer that wants read access to all the subscriptions, but we don't want to give them write access. So it's important to start thinking about how we do that. The first thing that we would encourage people to use is their internal or their core Active Directory is their single source of truth. This is the best place, because you don't want to be creating a separation of people and identities, because if someone leaves or joins, you've got one place to then basically add that person or take away their rights. So make sure within Active Directory, when you've got people, you start mapping out the groups within AD that map to the roles. So once you've done on paper in terms of working out what the roles look like, create the groups in Active Directory, and then what you can do with the Azure AD sync is then you can, which is a small agent that you need to deploy, it then will sync all those groups into Azure AD. And that gives you great ability to make sure that that you've then got all the right people up to date, and the groups can then map to certain roles. So within Azure, you can then take those mapped groups and people and identities within Azure AD and then build off your RBAC control. So you can give them specific roles and access controls. We would definitely encourage people to enable MFA. 100% for anyone with any level of admin privileges, but as much as you can do. It doesn't cost you anything, and there's a lot more kind of security attacks where people are sending out emails whereby they're trying to encourage people to log into something that looks like an Office 365 document, grabbing their credentials and then and obviously with the same credentials, you're going to be getting into Azure admin. So make sure you use MFA, but also if you're paying for some of the additional kind of Microsoft 365 services, you've also got the ability to start implementing conditional access. So you can then determine of maybe where someone, which countries are allowed to access, through the right credentials, and start putting some rules and around that. So from a role perspective, there's 4 core roles, or 3 really. You've got kind of a reader role, which is, as it says, you can you just get a kind of basic level to view information. The top end, you've got an owner, which is a God role, and then contributor, which is in between, whereby you get admin level access, but you don't have the kind of top level God level privileges. And then the resource specific role is where you can be more granular. And all of this is, there are loads of out of the box granular resource specific roles that you can get from the Azure portal, or you can, it's all able to be coded and define your own parameters as well. So it's all flexible. All about control. 7 is around configuring the guardrails. If you remember earlier, we talked about defining the governance, starting to put those policies together. So the next step, and it's really important, is defining programmatically those guardrails. Now, there's a few things, and what I mean by that is within Azure, if you say, for example, let's take one of the top level example, we only allow people to deploy resources in UK South and UK West because we've got data which can't go out the UK. It's all right writing that on paper, it's all right testing and teaching the teams, but actually you want to enforce that. So within Azure, you've got the ability to create policies. They're massively powerful, totally underutilized by most people who use Azure, but you can set up a standard set of policies that start enforcing the things that you care about. And I've put some recommendations here. So regions, tagging. So one thing that we want to make sure is when people launch a resource, they put the sticky notes, the taggers against it. So what cost center does that bill go against? Who manages that? Is it production, non-production? All these kind of little information you need to know. You can do things like do not delete locks. So when you've got a production service, to stop people running that script, you can basically put a lock on it that people can't make configuration changes or delete things in that production environment without going through and taking the lock off. So you've got some different kind of things there to catch problems and to stop it. And then you've got a range of other things that I've talked about here. The other thing is making sure that the monitoring. So within Security Center, there's something called an initiative. So an initiative is a group of policies, and these policies are all about monitoring. So if you've got logging enabled within the services, you can use Security Center to give you a dashboard for basically monitoring a whole set of kind of security, hygiene, and the rules that you've put in place. So you've got a nice, easy place for your security officer or yourself to go and have a look through of what, how you're doing against those rules. So use Azure policies, use Security Center, and make sure you keep improving on that on a regular basis. Now, a last bonus one that I wanted to talk about was cost control, and this is probably just as important as the rest of it because the best place to start with is Azure cost management. So within the portal, there's loads of capability you can do with Azure cost management. I put a link here on the slide to a training course. It's an online course. I think it's only an hour long, but it gives you the basics of how to use it. So my tips would be is to make sure that you enforce a range of tags, because when you're looking at using cost management, you can use tags to carve up subscriptions and cost. So maybe you've got a project that's project A, but it's across multiple subscriptions, or you've got dependencies, or you want to look at SQL types, or or production, non-production. You can use the dynamic of a tag to then carve up your bill to then further analyze, where that spend's going. What you need to use Budget Manager. So for each subscription, create a budget, then create a spend alert, Now, typically, you can create a spend alert on monthly spend, but you get percentages, so you can say set an alert up when it goes to 50%. Now, if you're worried about trying to catch that accidental problem, what you want to do is maybe set a low bar cost alert that maybe kind of like at 50%, whereby you can just do a mind check where, I've got the alert through, am I halfway through the month or am I only 2 days into it? So I think, you can be granular with those. There's a great Power BI out-of-the-box template that you can then pull in all that cost management data. So that's there, and just review it on a regular basis. And by that, sit down with the governance team and drive down that cost. It's there to be optimized. There's PaaS services, new instance types will come out, shut down resources, right size stuff, and just keep on top of it. So that's my tips, and just to go through, I've got a quick slide here of how you use the different elements that we talked about to fix those problems that we saw at the start. So you've got do not delete locks to stop people doing stuff with scripting, budget alerts to catch problems, tagging policies, management groups, and then just make sure you're modernizing and using Azure. So I hope you found that useful, and some tips there that you can take away and apply to your business today. If you're feeling maybe a bit overwhelmed, or there's things that I've talked about that maybe you don't, you want to go into a bit more detail, we've got a whole range of services that work with a cloud adoption framework to help you with everything we've discussed today and a lot more. And we can take you through that whole adoption process, as well as in life of handling that governance piece, from policies and cost management to actually doing the operational side as well. So give us a shout. You can find us on the Azure Marketplace as well if you search for Node 4. And hopefully you found this of use, and I'll be around to answer any questions you have. Thank you.